8:14 a.m. in Washington, 4:14 p.m. in Tehran. And for the first time in 13 nights, U.S. Central Command has nothing to announce. No strike statement, no list of targets, no post on X confirming another round of bombs over Bushehr or Isfahan. Just silence. Signal number one, silence in this war is never just silence. For 13 straight nights, American aircraft had been hitting Iran, command centers, missile sites, drone launch positions. Every night, like clockwork, the same CENTCOM statement landed on schedule. Then, on Friday, nothing. By Monday, Donald Trump was telling reporters aboard Air Force One exactly why. They asked us very nicely. He said, "Please stop. Let's meet." And that's where we are right now. See what happens. That's the official story. Iran asked for a pause. America gave them one. But here's what nobody is telling you. There's a second channel behind that phone call, one running through a country most people wouldn't guess, and it's been carrying messages between Washington and Tehran for months. We'll come back to that. Remember it. Because right now, the bigger question is simpler and far more dangerous. Is this pause the beginning of peace, or just the reload before the next barrage? To understand where this goes in the next 72 hours, you need to understand how we got here. This war did not start last week. It restarted on February 28th of this year, when a fragile understanding between Washington and Tehran finally broke. Israel had never signed on to that original memorandum of understanding. It was always a U.S.-Iran deal, not an Israeli one. And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made his skepticism public from the start. For months after that, the two sides limped along, talks in Oman, messages through intermediaries. A ceasefire that held barely, then didn't. Then came July. On July 6th and 7th, the temporary truce collapsed for good. Iran struck at U.S. regional allies. The U.S. launched what CENTCOM called a series of powerful strikes against more than 80 targets inside Iran. Washington reimposed sanctions on Iranian oil exports in the same breath. Within days, Iran said its military had struck and disabled 2 rogue supertankers. The UAE said Iranian missiles had hit 2 of its own tankers inside Omani waters, killing 1 crew member. The U.S. Navy didn't wait. It reimposed a full naval blockade on ships moving in and out of Iranian ports. That single decision changed the shape of this war. Global oil prices jumped more than 9% in a single trading session. Before this conflict even began, Brent crude was sitting around $72 a barrel. Within weeks of the blockade, it was climbing hard, and analysts started warning clients that until the Strait of Hormuz stabilized, the bias was for higher oil, higher inflation, and rougher markets ahead. That's the domino effect in one sentence. Close the strait, and you're not just hurting Iran. You're hurting every driver, every airline, every central bank on earth that has to answer for the price of a barrel of oil. Then the strikes kept coming. Night after night after night. 13 consecutive nights, according to CENTCOM's own count. Missile and drone launch sites, maritime capability, military command infrastructure. Iran's Ministry of Health says at least 53 people have been killed inside the country since July 6th. Nearly 600 more injured, according to Iran's Tasnim news agency. On the American side, the Pentagon has confirmed close to 100 U.S. service members hurt since the fighting resumed. Most of them minor injuries, though CNN has reported the military was slow to disclose even that. 3 of those service members died. Trump said publicly that Iran would pay for their deaths. Hours later, CENTCOM confirmed more strikes. Here's the catch. While the bombs were falling on military targets, ordinary life inside Iran kept sliding. Food prices have exploded. Iranian outlets report vegetable oil up more than 400% in a single year. Eggs and chicken both up by roughly the same staggering margin. Some staples have tripled or quadrupled in price since Iran's current president took office. That's not collateral damage from a single airstrike. That's an entire economy being strangled in slow motion. And it's happening while state television insists daily life in Tehran's bazaars carries on as normal. Both of those things are true at once. That's what a modern war actually looks like from the inside. Meanwhile, at sea, the blockade kept tightening its grip. U.S. officials say the Navy has redirected at least a dozen commercial vessels since reimposing the blockade. 2 ships that refused to comply were disabled outright. One tanker, the Comoros-flagged MT Charminar, was boarded by American troops in the Arabian Sea for what the military called a verification boarding before it was allowed to continue. One tanker in the Gulf of Oman was disabled after its crew tried to break through the blockade 4 separate times. Every one of these incidents ripples outward. Saudi Arabia has intercepted drones fired from Iraq at its own oil facilities in the eastern province. Saudi forces have struck Houthi targets in Yemen after the Iran-backed militia hit a Saudi vessel in the Red Sea. Iraqi militias tied to Tehran deny involvement, calling the accusations fabrications. This is no longer a 2-country conflict. It's a lit fuse running through half the Gulf. And now for the pivot, because this is where the story stops being simple. You'd think a pause in fighting means both sides are ready to talk. Iran's own foreign ministry says otherwise. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has been publicly, repeatedly blunt. There are no negotiations. Messages, yes. Negotiations, no. We do not have any faith that negotiations with the US will yield any results, he said. The trust level is at 0. So what exactly is happening in that silence? This is where we come back to the channel we mentioned at the start. The one running through a country most people wouldn't expect. For weeks, Pakistan has been quietly facilitating contact between Araghchi and Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff. Not as a headline mediator like Oman, which has hosted the formal rounds of talks. As a back channel, a discreet corridor for messages when the formal track goes cold. And more recently, CNBC has reported something bigger still. A China-led push to restart stalled diplomacy, also routed through Pakistan. Iran has signaled it will reciprocate the current pause specifically because of that effort. Read that again. The two countries doing the most to keep this from becoming a full regional war right now aren't sitting at the table. They're Pakistan and China, working the phones behind the scenes while Washington and Tehran trade public threats. That's the third person in the room nobody's talking about on cable news. And Araghchi himself has described just how strange and how dangerous those direct exchanges with Witkoff have actually felt. In an interview with Iran's Mehr news agency, Araghchi says he once asked Witkoff directly, "Have you ever sat in a meeting knowing it could be bombed at any moment?" He says Witkoff and his team just stared back at him in silence. Whether or not you believe every detail of that account, the underlying reality is not in dispute. These are negotiations, or whatever you want to call them, being conducted by men who believe the building around them could be a target. Now, the hardliners, because they are the reason every fragile pause in this war keeps collapsing. On the Iranian side, it was a guarantee that never came. According to reporting from Israeli outlet Israel Hayom, Trump's decision to resume strikes in early July followed a specific message from Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Araghchi had told them he could not promise the Revolutionary Guard Corps would stop firing on ships in the Strait of Hormuz. No guarantee, no truce. Within days, the bombing campaign was back. On the Israeli side, it's Netanyahu. He has been a consistent, vocal advocate for finishing the job on Tehran, openly skeptical that Iranian officials are negotiating in good faith on anything, especially the nuclear file. He and Trump speak constantly. Israeli readouts describe calls where Trump updates Netanyahu on American moves in the Gulf almost in real time. And this week, Netanyahu is flying back to Washington for his 7th visit to Trump since this presidential term began. Officially, part of that trip is personal. He's attending the funeral of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, a man Netanyahu has called one of Israel's greatest friends. But nobody believes that's the real reason for the trip. Netanyahu's own office says the agenda is Iran, full stop, and that Israel wants any deal to include hard limits on Iran's ballistic missile program and an end to its support for allied militias across the region. In other words, while Trump is testing a pause, the man sitting next to him in the Oval Office this week has spent the entire war pushing in the opposite direction. That tension right there is the single biggest reason this silence could end at any moment. Here's the second pivot. Even Washington's own restraint has a hard limit, and it isn't political. It's logistical. CNBC reported this week that Trump brushed aside mounting concerns from his own officials about a depleting U.S. munitions stockpile after weeks of sustained strikes on Iran. 13 nights of bombing runs is not free. Precision munitions, interceptor missiles, carrier-based sorties, all of it draws down a finite supply. And some of that supply is shared with allies watching other flashpoints around the world. Trump publicly dismissed those worries. But the fact that the concern reached the president's desk at all tells you something the strike statements never will. Even a superpower's appetite for an open-ended air war has a ceiling. So does that mean the pause holds? Maybe. Markets certainly reacted like it might. On Monday, Brent crude fell more than 6.5% to around $90 a barrel. U.S. crude dropped over 6% to roughly $84. Stocks opened higher on the news before paring some of those gains as the day wore on. Traders want to believe this is real. They've been burned before. This exact ceasefire has collapsed once already this month, and a temporary truce before that one collapsed too. So where does that leave us, 3 days into the quiet? Iran says there are no negotiations, only messages. The Pentagon isn't confirming why it skipped a night of strikes. Pakistan and China are working a channel most of the public didn't know existed until this week. Netanyahu is on a plane to Washington with an agenda that has nothing to do with slowing this down. And Trump has been crystal clear about what happens if the quiet doesn't turn into a deal. If we don't make a deal, he said Monday, we go back to the same thing. The same thing. 13 nights of strikes, a blockade strangling the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices swinging 9% in a session. Food prices in Tehran up 400% on basic goods. 53 dead, 600 wounded, and rising. That is the choice sitting on the table right now, not in some abstract future, but in the next 24 to 72 hours. Deal or bombs. Diplomacy through Islamabad and Beijing quietly building something that can hold, or one more collapsed guarantee from a hardliner in Tehran, or Jerusalem tearing it apart before the ink is dry. 3 days of silence has already told us one thing for certain. In this war, silence has never once meant it's over. It has only ever meant someone, somewhere, is deciding what happens next.